Welcome to the Way Forward Regenerative Conversation Podcast number 34, Intergenerational Climate Activism, a conversation with Change the Chamber. I'm Jim Burke, the producer. In this episode, host Dr. John Izzo and Alain Gauthier engage in a conversation with youth climate activists Tony Passino and Sarah Hill from the organization Change the Chamber. The discussion revolves around the resurgence of youth activism on college campuses, particularly in relation to the climate emergency. Tony and Sarah share their personal journeys into activism and discuss the work their organization does in fighting the fossil fuel lobby by targeting the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and advocating for climate-friendly policies. The conversation delves into the growing anxiety among younger generations about the future of the planet and the importance of finding hope and determination in the face of the climate crisis. The guest and the host explore the power of intergenerational collaboration in addressing these issues, emphasizing the need for both younger and older generations to work together and hold each other accountable. They also discuss the upcoming collaborative events between Change the Chamber and Elders Climate Action, highlighting the significance of intergenerational solidarity in the fight against climate change. Tony is a passionate environmental activist currently working on his PhD. His journey into activism began after the passing of his grandfather, whose impact on the community inspired Tony to get involved. Initially focusing on tobacco control and vaping prevention, Tony eventually shifted his focus to environmental activism, which led him to work with Change the Chamber. Sarah's activism journey started in middle school when they became concerned about the environmental impact of styrofoam lunch trays used in the school they attended. Sarah is a non-binary climate activist who is a current climate fellow and the outreach and response coordinator for Change the Chamber Lobby for Climate. They earned their Masters of Energy and Environmental Management this past May. We would like to thank our newest sponsor, Elders Climate Action. They are dedicated to mobilizing elders to address climate change through education, advocacy, and action, ensuring a sustainable and just future for all generations. We would also like to thank Elders Action Network for co-sponsoring this podcast and supporting the voices we bring to these important conversations. And now for our hosts, Dr. John Izzo and Alain Gauthier.
Hi, I'm Dr. John Izzo, and on behalf of my co-host, Alain Gauthier, and our producer, Jim Burke, I want to welcome you to this episode of the Way Forward Regenerative Conversations podcast, where we explore issues and ideas about the future of humanity and planet with a specific focus on the role that those over 50, this emerging group of elders, can play in creating a better society and a better world, as well as purposeful aging for all of us. So welcome. It's great to have you here. Just a week or two ago, Salon ran an article about the protests going on campuses across America. It said the following: the last few weeks have seen protests against Israel's war in Gaza occur at many dozens of colleges and university campuses across the United States. Student protests and other acts of solidarity have also been taking place internationally. It's far too premature to describe the protests as a mass movement. However, public opinion polls clearly show there are great levels of discontent among America's young people, not just about Israel's war in Gaza, but about a range of other public policy concerns, such as America's role in the world, the global climate emergency, the neoliberal regime, and the type of financial precarity it has caused for huge swaths of the public. And Alain, as I was thinking about our conversation today, which is really going to focus on a particular group of youth activists who are involved around climate in particular, I couldn't help but think about this particular moment in time where really for the first time in some time, it feels like campuses are starting to boil again with youth activism. And I was thinking of when I went to university, started my freshman year in September of 1975. Now, those of you who are around then will remember the war had just ended the year before. Nixon had been impeached in the Watergate trial. Gerald Ford was president. And when I arrived on campus, I was did a bit of youth protesting. I remember protesting at the Nixon second inaugural in 1973, after he'd been elected in 1972. And when I arrived in university, there was no activism. No one was interested, it seemed, in anything except for getting a job and getting ahead. And it could be argued that over the next 20 years or so, into the 2000s, that was pretty typical of campuses across America. Youth activism, while there were maybe pieces of it here and there, had really gone dormant. And I think we've seen in this last decade with Gen Zs and the younger millennials, a really revival of youth being involved in trying to change the society they're a part of. And so I'm so excited today, not just to talk about climate activism among youth on campuses, but also just generally what's happening with this generation around some of these timely issues. So I'm really excited. It's a topic we have not covered here, and I'm excited that we're going to get to.
I'm excited too, John. And I remember I was in 1968 in Paris, and that was a memorable time. But then when I went to Stanford in the late 60s, it was not as active.
Great. So Tony and Sarah, let's get you guys into the conversation. Welcome into the podcast studio. It's great to have you here.
Thank you for having us. I know I, for one, am excited to be here. I won't speak for Tony, but I think he is too.
Yeah, it's great to be here. It's actually funny just thinking about it. The last time Sarah and I were on a podcast, we were on a podcast together in a different setting. So we're back.
Wonderful. Great to have you here. And I was thinking, Alain, just building one more on what you said. I wanted doing my PhD, and Tony, I know you're working on your PhD right now, and I got mine from Kent State University in Ohio, but it was long after the events of 1968, I think it was, when the 4 students were killed by the National Guard there. But some of my professors had literally opened doors to protect students from the National Guard during those protests. And I couldn't help but think of that because about 50 professors at least have been arrested across the United States in these latest round of protests. But let's get started. First of all, you two are involved with an organization called Change the Chamber. And either one of you can take this. Pretend we met on an elevator and I said, what do you do? Well, I'm a student, but I'm also involved in this organization called Change the Chamber. So in an elevator ride, what is Change the Chamber and what has it accomplished?
So I will take this one. Change the Chamber, we're a coalition of young adults and over 100+ student groups that meet online to fight the fossil fuel lobby, a big part of which many people do not actually know is the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. So we focus on the U.S. Chamber of Commerce as well as the actual chambers of Congress, both to ensure that climate-friendly policies are being passed, as well as that climate obstruction is not happening, and we are trying to make sure we get out the vote so that climate-friendly politicians are elected. Is there anything you would want to add, Tony?
No, I think that was a quick elevator pitch. What we've been saying, I think more and more recently, is we agitate and we advocate. And so this looks like, meeting with people in Congress to educate them about specific issues, whether it's like issues like methane or CO2 emissions around different industries, right? Or we also educate. We have a whole environmental change maker certificate training that we've been building and sharing with folks across the country. And so we have about 20, 25 people at any given point in time working in different issue areas. So we do a lot for how big we are as a team. And yeah, we have folks all over the country.
That's wonderful. And every organization has an origin story. What's the origin story of Change the Chamber? How did it get started?
So neither of us were founding members, but we hear this story sort of all the time. So originally it was started by Deborah Rowe, who is the president of the U.S. Partnership for Education for Sustainable Development, a long acronym there. And so it sort of came into being just out of her exploring what needed to be done. And she always, I think, refers to herself as like a pusher to push people in the direction they need to be going. So she heard from others. And I think when she met with elected officials, she heard that the youth voice was one that they weren't hearing a lot from, but would be really powerful. So the idea of Change the Chamber sort of came into being, especially at the time there was growing focus on the climate obstruction that the Chambers of Commerce was doing. So I think in short, that is our origin.
Great, wonderful. And we're going to dig in a few minutes around the chambers of commerce, because I agree with you. A lot of us think of chambers of commerce. Isn't that something that was around in the 1950s, or are they still around? But let's get to that. But before we do that, let's talk about activism generally. And I know many of our listeners, many of our viewers who tend to be over 55, though we have a lot of younger viewers as well, have been activists in a variety of ways. And, I remember my first real experience of activism was when I was in high school in Staten Island, New York. And there was a green belt in the middle of Staten Island that was pretty much still intact parkland and private land that had never been touched. And developers were wanting to now cut into and really get rid of part of that green belt. And I remember as a high school student going to protest that. And years later, I, flew over Staten Island a couple of years ago and realized that green belt is still there. And a smile came to my face. I didn't take credit for it. I just did a few protests when I was in high school. But for each of you, very briefly, what's your first memory of activism? For you personally? It could have been when you were very young. What's your first memory, however you would define activism? So, Tony, let's start with you and then hear from Sarah.
Sure. Thank you. Gosh. Yeah, that's such a good question. I don't think it's one specific moment, but a few different things that happen over the years. I'm from a small town in Indiana, and in high school, I didn't care about a lot of stuff. I was a kid who slept in class every day. And I was getting towards the end of high school and my grandpa died. And, I grew up with him in my life, going to the holidays and everything, but I never really knew him. But when he died, I saw the sort of hole he left in my family. I saw that he was my mom's best friend, and I was like, wow, someone can have that much of an impact on someone's life. And that made me start to think, how can I show up for my mom and be the friend that he was to her? And that kind of made me learn more about his life. I went and talked to my grandma. I talked to some of his friends. And I started to understand that he had an impact not just on my mom, but on an entire community of people. Because he was the old school anti-war protester who was marching out there in the streets in small town Indiana when no one else was. And that inspired me to get more involved in my community. And from that point forward, I started to think, okay, how can I fill his shoes? And then through that, I started to discover my own shoes in activism. So I was really involved with tobacco control and vaping prevention for about 4 years. It's actually kind of ironic because my grandpa died from a smoking related disease. And so I went to high schools across the country and talked to young folks about the dangers of smoking and shared with them my story of being a former smoker of 10 years. And kind of through that, I grew and developed, and I started to realize that this was great. I was having an impact, but it wasn't the cause that I was most passionate about, which was the environment. And so from that point onward, about 4 years into my traditional activism career, I got more and more involved with environmental activism stuff. And yeah, that's part of like what led me here today. But yeah, thanks for giving some space to share that. I always think it's great to be able to kind of hear people's stories.
Yeah, it's wonderful. Honor to, is your grandfather, you said?
Yeah,
Such a big impact on you. So I honor his life that continues in you. Sarah, let's how about you?
Yes, thank you. So for me, I can recall sort of the exact first experience I had in activism. I still credit it as being what has brought me where I am today. When I was in middle school, actually, I got really concerned and sort of frustrated with all the styrofoam lunch trays that my school was using because I knew how environmentally harmful they were. It was great. I had a lot of support from my parents, and my dad was a long-term volunteer with the American Lung Association. So I think it really helped that they encouraged me to just go for it. So I sort of dove into activism and got my friends involved in writing a petition that I then took around to all my classes and gathered as many signatures as I could. And I do remember it wasn't always positive reactions that I got from people. I remember I had a science teacher who was like, "What? I like climate change. It means I don't have to shovel my driveway." And at the time, I was a middle school student, so I was too afraid to say anything in response. But petitioning did work in terms of it got me a meeting with the principal of the school and the region's waste manager. So I did get into a meeting with decision makers, but unfortunately, I was shut down because I was a middle school student, so I was a little unexperienced and I didn't know everything on the topic. So they gave me the line that it's okay that they use the styrofoam trays because they burn them, which anyone that knows anything about styrofoam knows is not okay at all and maybe worse. But as a middle school student, I walked out of the meeting, but then I used it for fuel to write my application to colleges once I was in high school, and from there I've just been determined to eventually change the styrofoam trays to an environmentally friendly option.
And in a moment, Alain's going to take us really talk about what's generally happening perhaps with your generation. But I want to pause on something you said that's so important. If anyone's listening today and they care about an issue, Tony, you gave a great example with tobacco. Sarah, you with the styrofoam. Is if you see an issue, just do something. I'm thinking of my friend Rex Weiler, who was one of the early Greenpeace guys who actually led the whale campaign when they went and confronted the Russian whaling fleet in the middle of the Pacific Ocean to stop whaling. And years later, he had a very young activist come to him and say, Rex, I want to do something like you guys did. I want to go out and stop the whale hunt or something. And Rex said, well, he said, why don't you just go back to your community and figure out something that you think needs something done about it and start there. So the young guy went back and just realized that in his neighborhood, very few people recycled. The bins were pretty empty and often people didn't put them out. So he made it his campaign to go door to door through all the streets in his community. And he made a big difference. But it started where he just said something right in front of me. So whatever age you are, if there's something right in front of you, that's a great place to begin. So thanks for your two stories. So Alain, let's dig into some what's happening with this generation more globally.
Yes, indeed. And as you reminded us, John, there has been a good deal of research about the growing anxiety in this generation of younger adults about the future of the planet, including many saying they would not want to bring children into the current state of affairs. So what's your sense of youth anxiety about the state of the world, and how have you experienced that personally?
Yeah, so I'm just gonna start off because it has been definitely climate anxiety has been a big factor in my own planning for my future life. I'm in the process of applying to jobs and thinking about where I want to live in the future. So I know whenever I think about where I want to move and where I want to live and work, I'm thinking, okay, how likely is it to flood where I would live? How likely are severe storms and events that are just going to impact my daily life? So that's a big anxiety for me, as well as I do understand the concern about bringing new children into the world when we're facing these problems already. But that's a tough point where it's easy to get bogged down in doom and gloom, which I know Tony sort of takes a good approach on. And he thought of this originally when viewing this question of how do we take people out of the doom and gloom so we don't get stuck. So if you want to speak, Tony.
I think it's something that a lot of people, not just younger people, are navigating right now. I think, with everything that happened around the pandemic over the past few years has really brought to light a lot of these issues and exacerbated a lot of these issues. And the climate dread is one thing, and the anxiety, but when you stack on top of it all of these other issues that young people are caring about, it can be overwhelming. I think with the thing related to climate, a lot of the messaging is very doom and gloom. I mean, I turn on the news every night and there's always a segment on some weather related event, and they always seem to try to make the connection to climate. And that can be overwhelming. I think also it can be kind of inspiring in a way for someone who is maybe just coming to want to take action on these issues. They see the state of the world and they're like, oh my gosh, I have to do something about this. But for long-term sort of sustained activism, it's something that like climate activists, like we're dealing with every day, right? And we have to figure out ways to navigate that. We have to figure out ways to care for ourselves, to work through this kind of anxiety. I think one really positive thing, that we're doing at Change the Chamber is we're really trying to sort of shift the narrative a little bit away from doom and gloom. Not to say that like those talking points don't matter. They're very important, right? But it's also good to have hope. It's good to have hope in our day-to-day work as activists. It's good to have hope for the future of our planet, because that helps us to sustain ourselves in the work that we do and helps to prevent us from being burned out. Yeah, I would be curious how you all navigate that in your work as activists dealing with the burnout and the sort of anxiety around climate.
Lon, go ahead.
Thank you. Yes, I like what Joanna Macy talks about when she talks about active hope. Active hope comes from actually engaging with the things that are most troubling in a way that we don't know what will happen. We can't predict it. But the fact that we are engaging in it is a way to reduce the effect of the anxiety on us in a way. So that's the way I would answer it in a general term. But John, what would you say?
Yeah, I would agree. I think the best way to reduce one's anxiety is to be in control in some way. If you think about it, where most of our anxiety comes from feeling out of control, and you look at things like the climate emergency or, what's happening in international relationships around the world, and you go, well, what? I feel powerless. So anything that can make us feel powerful, which we are collectively powerful, I think that makes a big difference. And, I think one difference maybe, Tony and Sarah, for people our age is, I remember interviewing a woman years ago who was Cesar Chavez's assistant for many years, the farm worker activist. And she said, when you're young, you cry for yourself. By the time you're old, she said, you cry for the world. And I think one difference is we probably won't live through most of the worst effects of things like the climate emergency, but we're crying now for the world, right? Our anxiety is for those who are yet to come and those who are younger. So thanks for asking. That's a great question. Before we get into the Change the Chamber, which we're going to do next, just say a little bit about youth activism on campuses in America. It's been in the news right now because of the protests of war in Gaza, but I talked a little bit about, and Alain did as well, of our sense when we, went to university, what it was like. What's your overall take on what's happening on campuses around activism generally? How is it? How would you describe it? What's your sense?
I can talk about this a little bit. I don't know. It's encouraging, I think, to see people using their voice and getting out there. Clearly, a lot of people are upset about different issues around the war in Gaza right now. And there's a lot of folks who are out there actively, I think, using their voice. And I think there's a lot of folks out there who are actively trying to find their voice. And I think it's a long history, too, of activism on college campuses, across the country. People standing up for issues that they believe in. I think one of the things around everything happening in Gaza right now that comes to mind is the sort of push for divestment from military spending. And I know that that's something that is also a tactic that folks have used historically in different issue areas. I know it's something that sort of related to some of the work that we do around ESG investing. And I know, Sarah, that's like your wheelhouse. But yeah, it's just a different tactic, right? To try to put pressure to advocate for change. I think it also is, it's hard to tell sometimes, right, what the impact is of one protest or one action. But I think it kind of goes to some of maybe the points that were made a little bit earlier, is that those things build up over time and can contribute to and create a movement. So yeah, that's what's inspiring to me, is seeing so many people finding their voice and using their voice.
Definitely. And I remember on my own college campus, when I was an undergrad, this issue of divestment was coming up a lot in the climate activism, because our school was set to renew their contract with Coca-Cola, which is like a major plastics producer, and plastics, of course, comes from fossil fuels. So I was actually involved in that activism around divestment and around the Coca-Cola contract. So I think this activism definitely has a long history that I know you both could probably speak to as well. But especially with divestment, we have to consider this is where I love ESG after I've learned about it, because it's environmental, social, and governance. So all of the things we don't always think about that our money does support or hamper in some way, it's so important that we really, the phrase "put your money where your mouth is very accurate. So that's just a fun insight.
Yeah, I always tell people, you vote every day. You vote every day by the companies you support, the products you buy, the comments that you make about companies that are doing good, the comments you make about critical companies that are, not doing so good. So companies get voted on every day, unlike politicians. So we have a real opportunity to make a difference there. Alain, let's really dig into the Chamber of Commerce now. I want to really understand what these guys are doing and how they see the Chambers of Commerce as such an important piece of change.
Yeah, I'll first say that there is a nice complex metaphor about your name, change the chamber, because it could be understood narrowly as change the Chamber of Commerce, but broadly change the chambers, including Congress. So can you tell us a bit about that, and what might surprise people about how powerful the chambers of commerce are at this time?
Definitely. So change the chamber. Focusing on chambers of commerce, we target the U.S. Chamber of Commerce since it's the widest, but it is interesting because there are local chambers of commerce, but they are not always members of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. So a little interesting distinction there. But the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, obviously people always think of, oh, businesses, they just influence business, and that's fine. But they also influence politics and legislation a lot, because with the powerful businesses they have, they sort of control, I think you could think about our economy in many ways. So they have a long history of supporting fossil fuels and of climate obstruction, which, Tony, if you drop the link, Change the Chamber has published a few different reports on climate obstruction, including the sort of environmentally unfriendly legislators that the Chamber of Commerce has helped to get elected. So that's very interesting. And then that directly ties into the chambers of Congress because they're the ones responsible for passing or stopping from being passed environmental legislation.
And I'll build on that slightly. And so like that's kind of almost like the theory of what we do, but the actual work and the practice of what we do with, we'll meet with elected officials to educate them about specific issues, kind of like what we were talking about earlier. But we'll also meet with corporations to try to hold them accountable. There's been different campaigns that we've sort of pushed out before in the past, and some different things we've worked on with some of our partners and our collaborators. I think it was Climate Action Campaign, or it was Climate Action Campaign or Climate Voice. It was one of the two, but there was a campaign called Escape the Chamber. It was basically asking on member corporations of the Chamber of Commerce who are like pro-climate or say that they're pro-climate, really putting pressure on them to leave the Chamber of Commerce, just because of the Chamber's long history of, again, like Sarah was saying, supporting the interests of fossil fuel industries and big oil. So yeah, there's a lot of different work I think that there is to be done.
So you guys, and it is really interesting, one of our previous guests, Sephora Berman, was saying that at the most recent COP conference, how many fossil fuel lobbyists are there? There are almost more fossil fuel lobbyists than there are people from the governments that are there. And it's just a great reminder of the work that you're doing that we often forget. We focus so much on the political leaders that we forget that the consistent pressure that they are experiencing and the way their views on things are often shaped by lobbyists who represent the very interests that might be in the way of doing something about climate. So it's a bit of a circular kind of thing, isn't it? Like, so you have them, being both lobbied, but also educated by people whose self-interest is really against doing something.
Yeah, absolutely. It's the same side of, or just the other side of the same coin. You have folks who are trying to push out and get their interests supported in Congress. And then there's folks who are out there educating folks about these issues too. And so, that's, I think, where the voice of youth is really powerful. And I think a lot of legislators are open and willing to hear us out about the things that we're passionate about. I wish there was more of that. I think it's building. I think it needs to continue to build. More folks meeting with their elected officials, not just at the national level, but at the state and local level too. Kind of what you were saying. It's like, get out there in your community and make something happen. A lot of change can happen at that local level too, and it can build up.
Build up and build across generations.
Yeah, which is a great segue, actually, because your organization has been and is about to do some collaborative work with Elders Climate Action, which, of course, is an organization of elders dedicated to taking action and doing something about climate. So tell us about that, and we'd love some specifics. What have you guys been doing, and what are you about to do with Elders Climate Action?
Yeah, so June, I think, is Intergenerational Climate Action Month. I may get the name wrong, but so we've been meeting for months to plan 2 webinars that Elders Climate Action and Change the Chamber will sort of jointly host to educate others on the intergenerational success stories that there already are, as well as sort of individual activist stories and how activism has changed or developed over time. So those should be two really fun events. I think one is on June 11th and the other is on June 25th. Tony and I are both hosts on different nights. So that'll be fun. You can come and see our faces again. Yeah, I'll just pass it to you, Tony, if you want to say anything else.
I'm excited for the events too. Definitely for anyone viewing, come check it out. The kind of behind the scenes of the event is always kind of neat to hear about. And like Sarah was saying, we've been planning this for months. I think it was, I want to say like November or December that we had our first call with ECA. And it's not just us at Change the Chamber. I know we have some folks from the Sunrise Movement. And then I think some other folks, across the state of California, younger folks too, who are collaborating on this. And I think us meeting has been a testament to the power of intergenerational collaboration and conversations. I felt really comfortable in a lot of the meetings that we've had with one another. Everyone's been really receptive. I think sometimes for me as a younger person, entering a space where I am with older folks, there can be a really strange power dynamic that shifts a lot of the power away from me just because of the experience that's in the room. But I haven't really felt that, with our work with Elders Climate Action. And I think that is really, it does speak to the folks who have been helping to organize this. I know Jen Chandler has played a huge role in this and really trying to create space for us to be able to share our ideas and our thoughts and making us feel comfortable too. And so, yeah, it's been really great so far. And I'm definitely looking forward to those events and also what we can do moving forward too.
And I assume they're open to anyone if we post that on our podcast. Great. So we'll post that link. Alain, over to you.
As you know, there is an entire movement today of younger people highly critical of the state of affairs that the baby boomers have left for younger generations to deal with. Okay, boomer, what is your strongest critique of our generation and what do you want from the emerging crop of seniors? How can they be most helpful? And how can we best collaborate together?
I do love this question because sometimes I think it goes unasked and unanswered, but both of you, as well as Elders Climate Action, does a good job of sort of overcoming my personal critique of the baby boomer generation. My critique is when older generations do admit that they caused or they were around when the problem of climate change got started, but then will go on to say, but it is your generation who will save us. And personally, I don't want that pressure put on my shoulders. It's not the younger generation's responsibility to completely solve this problem. It's an intergenerational effort, like we've been talking about. So I think Tony may be best able to talk about what we want from the emerging crop of seniors, but that is my own thoughts in response to that question. Yeah.
Well, Sarah, though, just before Tony comes in, you said something really important. It's just profound, actually, right? What I heard you say is, please don't tell us we made the mess. Now it's your job to clean it up. And think about like a parent going into their kid's room after they messed up the room and say, now, look, it's your job to clean it, right? And so just us admitting that not only have we contributed to it, but that we need to be equal partners in doing something about it. And we've referenced it before, but there was a survey done some time ago asking each generation who was most responsible for the challenges that we face, especially around climate, but other things, and who was most responsible to fix it. And what really, everyone agreed that the older generations were most responsible for creating it. But what was interesting is each generation said young people were most responsible to do something about it. So it turns out a lot of younger people have also let us off the hook. And I always say, if you've got a parent or a grandparent and they're still in the game, alive and kicking, look, don't let them off the hook. And if you're listening and you're our age, you're not off the hook, you're on the hook. So I really appreciate that. Tony, how about you? And what do you really expect from us? How can we collaborate together most effectively?
I love where you were going with that. I was thinking the same thing too, and I'll just echo that. Yeah, we're holding you accountable, and I think that's really important. I think there's things I think that we all bring to the table, right? When trying to understand and address some of these issues revolving around climate. And I think when we collaborate, we can increase our potential to have a positive impact. I think from the perspective of the younger generation, we bring, I think, a lot of new ideas to the table. We haven't been as deeply involved with a lot of these issues for as long as some of the more elder folks who have been doing this work for quite some time. So we bring a different perspective to the table. And also, I think the elders, right, bring a different perspective to the table too, because y'all have been like, a lot of folks have been doing this work for a long time and have a strong network and know a lot of people who are also doing this work. And that's something that I think a lot of young people don't always have, is that network, because we just haven't had the time to build the relationships needed to really do this work so effectively. And so I think that right there is a really great opportunity for young folks to bring a new perspective in, but also for people who have been around for some more time to open up their network to young folks. And I'm all for that kind of collaboration. I've learned a lot in working with people from all different generations too. I'm not super critical, of the older generation, like the okay boomer in that question and everything, because I think that we all do play a role in trying to address these things. And if I'm coming at someone and being super critical, sometimes that can shut down the conversation. I still do believe that being critical in that way is important and does have value, but sometimes, I guess, interpersonally, I'm more so thinking like, how can we meet? How can we work on this together to work through these problems and understand these things? So,
yeah, and there's something really powerful when generations stand together, I think, because it sends a message of solidarity. And interestingly, most of us, and you gave an example, Tony, I have my own like that, of the special bond that young people often have with their grandparents. And I think a part of it is when we're in the middle of our life, we're so busy with our career and our focus on ourselves and raising our families, and that the older people, as people move into their 60s and get older, they're starting to think more about the future in a different way, not their own personal future, but the future of the world, just like young people are often, because they're coming into that world, thinking about that. And also, as people get older, they have more time. And so to use that time in solidarity can make a big difference. I want to ask you just a question I hadn't really planned to ask, but obviously young people played a very big role in the last election. They say that, President Biden would not have won if young people had not turned out in fairly good numbers. You certainly hear a lot about a lot of younger people kind of checking out of the voting process right now. What would you say to any young person listening who says, well, it doesn't matter who I vote for? And I'm not asking for a partisan statement here, just more, though you're obviously free to make them. But it seems to me like a lot of younger people feel like, the whole system is screwed up. And so why, doesn't matter who you choose. So talk to us a little bit about maybe that apathy about the electoral process that worries me a bit, even though I agree with the critique.
I think that's a really important question, but also one that sort of gets at like a hot issue. My initial thought upon hearing that is that it can somewhat be a luxury to check out and not to vote when you do not feel like you will be personally affected by a given election. I can share, like, I'm a transgender person, I'm non-binary, so I feel like with a given election, it really can determine how safe I feel living in general, if my rights are going to be respected and recognized. So I feel like even in terms of climate, if that's what motivates someone, that can be used to get them out to vote, because the climate policy decisions that we make now, if we really think about it, they're going to be impacting the world basically for the rest of our lives. So we sort of don't have the luxury to check out. And while the system as a whole may not be functioning in the way some people would like, we can't step away from it altogether.
So let me go back to the question of age. I wonder what's the average age in the Chamber of Commerce. We know that the average age in the House of Representatives is about 50, and it's above 60 in the Senate. So I'm wondering whether your collaboration with elder organizations like ECA is actually a good training ground, if you like, for understanding how to deal with elder people and the way their ideas might be fixed or somewhat immovable. Could you comment on that?
I think it could be considered a training ground in some ways. Obviously it's a completely different setting, right? When someone is wanting to collaborate and work with you versus someone who's like on the other side of whatever issue it is that you care about. But I think that there are some probably learnings that come from just working collaboratively with people from different backgrounds, but also different generations too. And, you know, when it comes to like the specific things, I can't really put my tongue on what the specific things are that, you know, you might learn from working with someone from a different generation. But it is, I think, one of those things that the more you do it, the more you get comfortable with working with someone who doesn't look like you or has a different sort of cultural code, right? Different references to different, you know, TV shows or different things throughout, you know, their lives. And I think when you work with people like that, it takes some of the scariness away from doing that kind of work, and it allows us to see the humanity in other people, you know. And I think that's really great too, because I mean, we're people, we're at different stages in our lives too, you know.
Yeah, one of the things I was thinking, by the way, if you guys are ever going to meet with somebody and you want an older person to go with you, count me in. You know, you lead the show. I'll just be a amen and hallelujah. But I think there is something too about the generations going together to these lawmakers who are often older, right? Because especially if the older people go in solidarity, the young people, and not trying to lead the show, right? Can be so important. There was something specific I wanted to ask you guys about for our audience, a lot of whom are really involved in the climate movement. You're working with something called Solutions for Pollution, as is Elders Climate Action. What exactly is Solutions for Pollution, and what are you guys doing with them?
Yeah, I think neither of us are directly involved a lot in what Change the Chamber does here, but I think I'll do my best here. I think Solutions for Pollution is sort of educating and putting maybe a little bit of pressure on lawmakers around environmental legislation and EPA raised, basically Solutions for Pollution, literally, regulations to manage and keep track of and minimize various forms of pollution, such as carbon, that I believe Tony previously mentioned. So that's where a lot of meetings with legislators comes in. And we don't do direct lobbying since we're C3, whatever it is, but we are there to remind them about and educate them about what bills currently are in place and what they can do to help our climate. So I think one thing we were interested in is if you know anything about what Elders Climate Action does with Solutions for Pollution.
Well, unfortunately, we don't, but we'll find out and make sure that we get that into the next podcast. Hey, I wanted to ask you guys a couple of personal questions. I'm going to ask one, and Alain's going to ask one. So this goes to each of you individually. What gives you hope about the future? based on the work that you're doing or what you're seeing in the world? What gives you hope? And Tony, why don't we start with you? Sarah spoke a moment ago. Tony, what gives you hope about the future?
Sure. I mean, conversations like this is one thing. Talking with people about this. Because it's like when we have these conversations, it's almost like we create a different world, or we create a different reality, right? And I really do think that increases the likelihood that we might be able to work towards that reality one day. And so when I'm doing this work as an activist and I see or I hear the story of another person, a young person, old person, anyone, right? Share what their vision is for the future when it comes to the climate and how they want to address these different issues and how they're really passionate about this one thing, right? That gives me hope. And because I see the motivation that they have, and then I start to think like, this is such a big issue. And I think we all have a piece of the puzzle to try to understand and address this big issue. But so when I hear the stories of other people and their motivation for trying to create a more positive future, that gives me hope too, because it makes me think I'm not the only one. And it also, I change my vision of the future every time I hear someone else's too, even if not like explicitly, it's implicit. It's like slowly changing as I hear more people's vision of the future too. So I think that's what gives me hope.
When you were saying that, Tony, I was thinking of David Cooperrider, who really started this whole work around appreciative inquiry. He has a great line that said, change begins with the first question. And so when we have these, we think of this as idle time, having these conversations, but it's not. Change actually begins when you start asking questions of each other and you start to explore and then create a common vision of the future. So Sarah, how about you? What gives you hope?
Well, I agree with Tony completely, but what gives me hope in terms of climate definitely is to see how much activism is going on and how many other people are working to make sure we have a sustainable future. And what I'll always think of now when I hear the question, what gives you hope, is I served as a mentor at the recent climate reality leadership training in New York. And one of the speakers, I think they asked this exact question. And one of the speakers says, I don't like the question, what gives you hope? What I want to hear is, what gives you determination? It's sort of reframing it in the way that we need.
Yeah, I love it. What gives you determination? Although I might come back a little bit and say, well, Tony kind of said this earlier, hope is what gives you the resilience to have determination. But you're right, hope isn't enough. It's going to hard work and determination and patience and all of that. So great answers from both of you. So Alain?
Yes, as you know, a part of the title of our podcast is regenerative conversation. So we asked that from our guests. How do you personally try to live regenerative life? And if you want to answer, each of you.
Tony, do you want to go first since I just
Sure.
spoke?
Yeah. I think, for a long time, and I think this is kind of mirrors a lot of the messaging that's happened. I think it's starting to change. But the solution to a lot of the issues revolving around climate, I think is put on the individual. And so, right, if we can just reduce how much electricity we have in our house, if we can just recycle more, then maybe we can try to address this issue. I think that's important, but I think it also can be a distraction sometime, and is like a tactic that's used by a lot of organizations to shift responsibility away from a lot of these large companies who are creating products that aren't designed to be reused in the first place, or are designed to fail, or who are continuing to contribute to a lot of these issues. I think it shifts the responsibility. And I think as I've come to better understand some of these issues, it's been a journey of trying to educate about that, because we can only do so much individually, but we have a voice. And I think this is coming back to, our work at Change the Chamber, is we're holding these companies, we're holding the chamber accountable, right? And we're using our voice to say, no, we can't just fix this by, recycling or by turning the lights off at night. We need you to change how you're operating and how you're handling and contributing to these issues. And so I think that there's a lot of power in that kind of work. And I think that's kind of wrapping into a lot of this conversation. And the part that gives me hope is seeing a lot of young folks using their voice on campuses across the country too. Yeah.
I think that's a great answer. But when I'm thinking of my personal life, and even in like the entire US or any economy, I'm thinking of to live a regenerative life, each of us needs to sort of, even before it's implemented, practice how would we function if we had a circular economy. That's sort of, I think, what you are getting at of what we need. So like in my own house, I still live with my parents, but we compost, we recycle, as well as minimize the plastic that we buy, because recycling is a whole thing. And then my dad has an electric vehicle, so he always drives that. But when I do have my own place, I want to be in a city so that I can have that access to public transportation. So it's little things like that. I think it's important to think about the big overall. We need a circular economy, but also to bring it back to the individual. Your own actions do matter, and we don't want you to feel powerless. The choices you make will make a difference, even if it's just pushing us towards where our society needs to be.
Alain, a closing comment from you, and then I'll close us out.
Yeah, I really appreciate what you just said, Sarah. And yes, we need the power of many voices, but what am I doing every day that actually points the way, especially if I can be, to some extent, not an example, but at least model some behavior for others? I do what I think about. So that's very good. And really appreciated both of your comments, and sensing that the path to intergenerational collaboration, which you are exploring, is something that is actually alive. We do place a lot of emphasis on that in some of the work we do among elders, that how do we connect with younger people, not from a hierarchical perspective in terms of experience, but more what can we learn from each other? And you certainly give the example of that. So thank you so much.
So Sarah and Tony, let me thank you, not just for the conversation today, but of course, for the way in which you've dedicated a good part of your lives to using your voice and your actions and your power to try to change things. And so thank you for doing that. And really, a couple of things stand out for me in the conversation today. One is that we're all on the hook across generations, and we have to put our hands together around this. And the second thing is that the antidote to anxiety is to find your voice and do what you can. Because when we find our voice and we do what we can, we feel powerful, and we move away from anxiety into action. And the third thing, I guess, that just strikes me is just a reminder that we have to pay attention to the power structure. And if you didn't listen to our most recent or one of our recent podcasts with Sephora Berman, it's a great companion to this one, and the way in which we have to work with the power structure, like you guys are with the chambers of commerce and like they are with the fossil fuel industry. So a great reminder that we can't ignore that, and we ignore it at our peril. Great time to announce that we have a new co-sponsor for our podcast in Elders Climate Action, joining the Elders Action Network as a co-sponsor of our podcast and the voices that we try to bring. And again, Change the Chamber and ECA are doing some great work this month in June together, and we'll post that along with this podcast. And I think everyone is welcome to join that. So again, thanks again for being here. And as always, mostly we want to thank you, our listeners. You're why we're here. If you love what you heard, Please share it, subscribe to our channels on YouTube or on wherever you're listening to this podcast. Share the word with others. That's how this audience grows for these important conversations. And if you have a critique or something you think we can do better or a topic you'd love us to cover, we'd love to hear from you. And I'll close the way we always close on this podcast, reminding each one of us that history is not a destination waiting for us to arrive. History is being made right now by what we do in this moment, and future generations will look back, and what they will call history will be the result of what we did today. So thank you. We'll see you next time on The Way Forward. Good day.
Thank you for taking the time to listen to the Way Forward Regenerative Conversations podcast. You have many choices, and we appreciate your interest and support. We want to hear from you. Please reach out to us at thewayforwardrc@gmail.com with your thoughts and feedback. Your input helps us create a podcast that you want to listen to and share with your friends. If you have guest recommendations, we would love to hear those as well. A special thank you to our sponsors, Elders Climate Action and Elders Action Network, who are building a movement of elders to address the environmental, governance, and social issues of our time. You can learn more about their work at eldersaction.org and eldersclimateaction.org. Until next time, I'm Jim Burke, and this is the Way Forward Regenerative Conversations podcast. You can listen to us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Podbean, and Amazon Music. You can watch us on YouTube. In parting, may I wish you a regenerative present and future.